All right, we are officially recording, so we're going to go ahead and start the webinar. So we'll officially get into it. This section is going to be super short. It's about women's advocates, just so you know a little bit more about the organization that I'm from, which is indeed the first domestic violence shelter in the nation in the United States. Over the last 45 years, we've learned a lot about domestic violence. We've expanded our physical space into 3 Victorian homes, which are all interconnected and located in St. Paul, Minnesota, where our mission is to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. We provide prevention and education services, provide shelter to 50 women and children every day with various advocacy and support programs. We also offer a housing program to help survivors find and maintain safe, sustainable, affordable housing for them and their children. So now that you know a little bit more about us, I'd love to know more about you all. So here's the second poll question about your professional position. So this will help me gear a little bit of the content specifically to your work and for us to all know who's on the call. So I'm going to send that out now. Go ahead and submit your votes. Again, if it's not listed on here, you can go ahead and type it in the chat. I see a lot of us have been introducing ourselves, so that's great. We've been really lucky to get a wide variety of different people who hold different positions to attend these webinars, and I think it really enriches the experience and the conversation, so I appreciate everyone being here. Okay, about 20 more seconds. So it looks like we have a lot of domestic violence advocates, which makes a lot of sense, as well as social service providers, mental health care providers, educators, legal, other related advocates like housing and sexual assault. Okay, 2 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, I'm gonna end the poll, share the results so you all can see who else is on the call with us. And then we'll go ahead and advance to this next slide. So my question is, what do you think of when you hear the term domestic violence? So I like to understand, more about what you currently associate with, well, this says domestic violence, it should say family violence. So when you hear the term family violence, what do you associate that with? Do you immediately think of children? Do you immediately think of parents? So certain types of violence in the household, what comes to mind? And so I think it's really important to understand your current conceptions, and hopefully by the end of this webinar, your responses to these prompts will be expanded. But it's important to know what you associate with and who kind of fits into that box, because if there's a certain person that you're helping or serving or supporting or advocating for, and they don't fit within that frame of what you think family violence is, someone, could fall through the cracks. So it's important because it shows up in how you advocate and how you understand family violence. So here's the next poll. I promise they won't be as in a row, but this is just to get us started. So the next poll is about how would you describe your current understanding of family violence? This is a 101, but I hope that there will be a lot of new information for those of you who may feel pretty confident about your knowledge. I know we've had people, advocates who have done this work for 20 plus years, and they like to do these webinars just to refresh their memory or see if there's any new statistics or if there's any new information. So this should be accessible for people with all different levels of knowledge. So it seems like a lot of people are saying they're pretty comfortable with their knowledge level. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? So hopefully we'll be able to at least provide some new resources, some new tools. So I'll give about 15 more seconds for people to submit their responses. And again, if you think anything is missing or you'd like to add any comments, please type them in the chat. I'll read them out loud. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll. So the predominant response was that the attendees have a decent amount of knowledge. So that's good to know. Okay. So now getting a little bit more into the prevalence of family violence. So if you had attended any of the previous webinars, you would have learned more specifically about children. If you attended the IPV intimate partner violence webinar, you would have learned more about that. So I wanted to focus these statistics specifically on things like sibling abuse and also children, because those are commonly the victims of family violence. Within this context, if you want to learn more about specifically children or specifically intimate partner violence, we have separate webinars for that. So just wanted to name that right away. And, oh, can people see my screen still? For some reason, it doesn't have a box around it. Maybe can people raise their hand if you can see it? Okay. For some reason, the green ring went around. Okay, so you can see the slide. It says definition of family violence. Okay, people are raising their hands. Great, thank you so much for doing that. So what exactly is family violence, right? It's when someone in a family or home hurts another family member or others in the home, right? Very simple definition. We'll get into the nitty-gritty later, but someone who may hurt a family member oftentimes does this to gain power and control over another person, right? So we've defined power and control on the screen. Everyone should have a certain level of their own power and control, but when someone tries to take that away from you, that can be a warning sign of abuse. And we'll talk a little bit more about those dynamics between like parents and children, but children should still have that autonomy, right? So this is just kind of where we're operating with what the broad definition is. All right, so a little bit more about who can cause or experience family violence. So anyone can experience or cause family violence, right? It's a public health crisis. So regardless of someone's ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, level of education, citizenship status, or religion. There's different ways that family violence can impact someone, whether they're directly experiencing it, they're exposed or have knowledge of others, like a sibling experiencing it, or witnessing others in the home experiencing it, like a parent, or potentially trying to intervene. Family violence can be caused by someone who lives in a home or is a family member, whether that's by blood or not. So this means harm can be caused by a parent, including step-parents or legal guardians, other caretakers, siblings, uncles, aunts, grandparents. It can include people who live in the home that are not technically blood related, but are considered family. So also note, again, the language I might be saying child or you or victim to describe the person experiencing the violence. So just be aware of that. Okay, so this is a slide, a topic that a lot of people have questions about and is kind of described as this hidden epidemic that people don't immediately think of when they think of family violence. So for siblings, that can be, again, biological, half-siblings, step-siblings, adoptive, foster, or even fictive, which is like a chosen family, right? So you consider that person to be a sibling, a sister, a brother, but they're not biologically related. So these siblings spend more time with each other, more than anyone else growing up typically. Those relationships provide companionship, support, and opportunities for play and engagement against an adversary, right? But they remain unique from other family relationships like cousins or parents, right? So up to 80% of youth experience some form of sibling maltreatment. So yet it's been called the forgotten abuse. There's a report that said therapists frequently overlook it. Usually the perpetrator is an older child, often the eldest, exploiting the emotional dependence and potentially weakness of a younger sibling. So studies have found that girls are at a greater risk of abuse, generally by an older brother. When a brother abuses a sister, often involves physical or sexual abuse. And of course, noting that sisters abuse one another as well. Healthy sibling relationships are linked to increased social competence, independence, self-control, companionship, general life skills, supports, and overall social, cognitive, and emotional growth. Um, but sibling bullying is the most frequent form of family violence, and it's often seen as a normal part of growing up by parents and health professionals, but there's increasing evidence that it can have long-term consequences like increased loneliness, delinquency, mental health problems, negative externalizing and internalizing behaviors, low self-esteem, and anxiety. So bullying occurs in situations where we cannot choose our peers, like in families. Siblings live in close quarters, and the familiarity allows them to know what buttons to press to upset their brothers or sisters. This can go both ways and allows a child to be both a victim and a perpetrator of the bullying. So again, more about prevalence. Studies found that the bullying was more likely to occur in families with 3 or more children, and the eldest child or the older brothers were more often the bullies, right? Underreporting of sibling abuse is predominantly due to societal denial of the seriousness of the problem. So there's no definition of sibling abuse or laws that govern it except for some sexual abuse laws. Resources for families are also lacking, so parents have no support and are often misinformed with this. Many expect sibling conflict and fighting, so they typically overlook it and confuse it with sibling rivalry. So if you want to learn more about that, I added a link to kind of understand the differentiation between that. Okay, so breath. That was a lot of words about sibling abuse. I wanted to dedicate an entire slide to it because, again, like that article said, it is a hidden abuse, and I think that people don't know too much about that. And we're going to talk about all the different forms in just a moment here, but I did want to mention a couple of specific things with sibling abuse. So emotional abuse between siblings is common, but again, difficult to research. But the effect shouldn't be underestimated. So that can include, name calling, belittling, teasing, shaming, threats, intimidation, false accusations, destroying a sibling's belongings. The abuser in that situation might use manipulative tactics such as playing the victim, deceit, threats, withholding, bribes, stonewalling, or trickery in order to exploit and gain an advantage over the younger child. Physical abuse is the deliberate intent to cause physical harm or injury. So that can include rough and violent behavior, pinching, choking, biting, slapping, kicking, hair pulling, physical restraint, or even including weapons. And then lastly, a little bit about sexual violence. So 93% are brothers abusing younger sisters. More than 1/3 of sex offenses against children are committed by other minors. So 93% are brothers abusing younger sisters. Sexual abuse is distinct from age-appropriate curiosity. So it may involve nurturing without the use of force. Behaviors include fondling, lewd acts intended to cause sexual arousal, masturbation, unwanted sexual advances, or forcing a sibling to view porn. So victims are usually sworn to silence and have no one to turn to. As they mature, they resist ongoing sexual violations. Offenders use threats of exposure or retaliation to secure secrecy. When parents are told, victims aren't believed and are met with hysteria rather than empathy. Often parents are in denial and doubt the victim's story to protect themselves and the perpetrator, who's another child. So that was a lot. Any questions about sibling abuse? I'll give it a moment if anyone wants to type anything in the chat or do a Q&A. But if not, we can definitely continue to move on. If you think of something later on, again, type it in the chat. All right, I think we're ready to move on to the next poll and the next slide. So my question is to learn a little bit more about which forms. So which forms do you want to learn more about? Which ones do you not feel as confident about? Which ones are you more curious about? I want to make sure we focus on the ones that are most prominent for you all. Although you will have access to the slides to explore all the other forms, even if we don't cover it in the webinar portion. So before I launch into the different forms, I did want to highlight these key points that I typed out at the bottom here, that all forms of family violence are serious. One form is not more real or serious than another. Number two, all these forms are harmful in different ways, which we'll talk about. Number three, no one deserves to be treated in any of these ways. Seems obvious, but definitely needs to be stated. Number four, the survivor knows themselves and the situation best. So context is really important, like age, personality, culture, different identities. These things don't happen in isolation. And then number five is that abusive actions are rooted in power and control, not love, equality, and respect. So that's important to know about, especially when it's in this family setting. Okay, so I'm looking at the polls. So it looks like a lot of people are interested in mental and emotional. So we will go to mental. So this is a form that some of you may have heard about, and we're going to distinguish the difference between mental and emotional in just a second here. So mental abuse includes things like anger or rage to manipulate someone, calling someone crazy or stupid, making it seem like the abuser's action is the victim's fault. It could even be staring at that person in a blank way that can cause fear. So that's something that actually is a big part of mental abuse, especially with family members, whether it's a parent or another sibling. People who have experienced trauma or abuse from other people can pick up on those subtleties. So for someone, an outsider kind of looking in, they might say, oh, they might observe an interaction and question, why did that instill fear? But maybe that stare or the way that that person, the minor nonverbal cues, victims can really pick up on that and associate that with different forms of harm, right? So that's a big one to know about. Another really common tactic is the silent treatment. So parents and also siblings and other family members, of course, can use this to create an environment of unpredictability, of you have no idea when that person might harm you, what might set them off, what's going on in their heads. Some victims talk about how they'd prefer to be screamed at, so at least they know what the abuser is thinking, whereas when there's silence, there's a lot of manipulation and control that happens with that. Okay, so the next one is emotional. So we're gonna skip on to that one really quickly. So mental abuse is often associated with emotional abuse. So an example of that could be a parent choosing a significant other over them. So maybe the parent ignores their child if the parent's significant other is around, or always prioritizing or taking the significant other's side and not listening or paying attention to the child's needs or wants at all. Parents could also use children as leverage within parental conflicts, like during a divorce or separation or an argument. And that is definitely emotional abuse as well. So either passing negative messages through each other, or sending threats or insults through the child to the other parent. So there's a lot on the screen. Feel free to ask any specific questions with that. But for children too, there's a lot of maybe sharing private information with others to cause embarrassment and shame. So this is really eliciting very visceral emotional reactions, and really tying into that person's emotional wellness. A lot of it too, it's not listed on here, but gaslighting, the hotline, the Domestic Violence National Hotline has a great article that explains all the different tactics of what gaslighting is. So I'll put the link to that. I'll do that right now. In the chat. We're going to have a webinar specifically on emotional abuse as well, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I will include that if you are curious and learning more, because that is a very, very common tactic in family violence. So I sent the link about gaslighting. All right, so I'm going to look at the poll. So the next form that people want to learn about is spiritual and cultural. Okay, let's skip over to that. All right, so the common theme in cultural or spiritual abuse includes creating an us versus them mentality and not allowing the child or the victim to think for themselves, isolating them and keeping them away from people who don't agree with them or share the same identities, or using spiritual authority to justify their actions or not allow the child to question anything that they do. So feel free, please type in the chat if you have ever, after reading through this list, if you've ever kind of seen these different tactics being used in families or individuals that you have helped or supported. Yeah, let me know. I guess a few out here on this list to point out more too is a lot about that control of saying, of using culture or spirituality or religion to isolate a specific victim away from other people. A lot of people turn to cultural or spiritual practices in order to cope with experiencing abuse. So when the abuse is rooted in targeting that person's identity or practices, that can be exceptionally harmful. So to be told that, you know, my actions that are causing you harm are justified because of something that you believe in, that's another form of gaslighting as well. Not taking accountability for what they're doing and placing that blame on others. Okay, we'll do one more. Okay, the next one is digital. So once again, we have a whole other webinar that we just did on Friday, all about digital abuse. So I'm gonna link that on this PDF before I send it out if you wanna watch that or pull up the slides. So a little more about digital abuse. So using technology as a tool for causing harm within a family. So this can include excessive monitoring of someone's every step. So something when we go into schools, high schools, middle schools, it's very common for students to talk about their parents or family members or even siblings using things like Life 360, which inherently itself is not violent or abusive, right? It's a security measure, it's a safety thing to make sure that if their child or their sibling or whoever goes missing or they're not responding to calls, they can use that to help locate them. But it can become abusive and harmful when they use these devices to create an environment of anxiety. So maybe they constantly check in by calling or texting nonstop or completely monitoring your every step and saying, oh, you said you were going here, how come you're here? In a way that's causing fear. And they might monitor social media accounts, control who you can talk to on the phone or laptop, or set up spyware or excessive parental control. So again, I'll link things about tech safety and things about how parents can parent during the digital age, but there's also different boundaries of that and using that tool where it can be helpful and loving. And then there's a line between that and causing fear and harm using these devices. So hopefully that made sense to everyone. Oh, sorry, I have to sneeze. My apologies. And so we have a bunch of other slides that you can look through about about the other forms. So reproductive is one that a lot of people don't know about as well. So I encourage you to look it up. I'll add a link too if you want to learn more. We've already talked a little bit about sexual. There's some more about financial, which is actually something that people really don't talk about when it comes to families or like parents or kind of if you know different family members give money to a child for their birthday and then the parent refuses to give that to the child, you know, other forms of that nature. So I'll let you look into that yourself. Verbal abuse is a really big one too. It seems like a decent amount of people wanted to learn more about that too, but I'll allow you all to read this at your own time if that's okay with everyone, so we can move on to the next topics, which includes warning signs. So after learning about all the different forms, attendees typically want to learn more about, okay, I get the different ways that families can cause harm. But, oh, here, I'm sharing the poll results of the other ones. You can click out of it. So, people typically want to learn more about how to identify if family abuse is occurring, right? So in addition to including warning signs that someone can observe from the person who is causing harm, I also added warning signs that you could observe for someone who's experiencing the harm. So these are things that you can identify in either yourself or others that you know or are supporting or helping. Some of these include so for the person experiencing violence, you might notice that they are obsessively trying to please that family member. Maybe they're hyper aroused or hyper avoidant. Someone may seem like they're not being harmed because they're doing well in school, but there's not one correct way to experience abuse, right? Or how to cope with that abuse. So people cope in different ways. Some students explain to us that they may quote unquote take the abuse because their parents say it's a sign of disrespect if they don't, or that the parent is the boss of the house, so they have the right to scream and yell or harm the child in any other ways that we've described before, which definitely speaks to the warning signs here. So as far as common themes within a family member, so if you're working with a family member and you're wondering if that specific family member is abusive, there's different themes within that too. So again, that blame, gaslighting, criticism, anger, using adult privileges or roles. Again, that ticking time bomb or silent treatment technique. So you might kind of uncover those different components if you're working with someone who you think might be abusive. And then again, a lot of other tactics and other components of someone who might be experiencing the violence. And of course, it depends on the age and it's very individual to that specific person, but those are some themes that you could pick up on if someone is experiencing violence. So I do want to do another quick poll to see if it's just a yes or no, or even maybe, if you personally have identified any of these warning signs that are on the screen in someone that you were helping before. And it's okay if it's maybe, because that's kind of what this webinar is for, is to learn more about how to identify it. And if you haven't yet, then that's great. Okay, we have about 30 more seconds for people to submit their votes. One thing I do want to note too is that any of these warning signs in isolation don't automatically mean, right, that that person is either causing or experiencing family violence. The context and taking other components into consideration are really important too. So just because someone is kind of withdrawn at school or not as talkative, it doesn't automatically mean that it's family violence, right? Okay, so it seems like the majority of us are saying, yes, we have seen these warning signs in someone that we've helped before. A couple are saying maybe, and just a few are saying no. So thank you for participating in that. Hopefully that portion was helpful. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier a little bit about that fine line between discipline and harm and abuse, right? So when it comes to family members, especially parents, that line can become blurry, especially if the abuse has always been labeled as discipline by an adult. So some of the differences are listed on the screen. So one thing to also be mindful of when determining if what someone is experiencing is abuse or discipline is how they feel emotionally, but also in their physical body. So paying attention to if that person clenches their jaw or fists, or if their shoulders are glued to their ears, if they get a headache or their stomach ache. Sometimes children specifically, even adults, they don't know how to communicate their emotions, right? So they might not be able to name what they're feeling or how they're being impacted, but they might say, I have a stomach ache or my head really hurts, because Of course, our emotional wellness is very much connected to our physical as well. Oh, I got a notification that people are raising their hand. Again, because it's a webinar with quite a few people on it, if you could send your message in the chat, that'd be the easiest way for me to understand what your question is or what your comment is. So please do that. Sorry, I just want to make sure you all know that. But one thing about that is it's normal to feel sad or ashamed if, a family member disappointed another family member. But if they're having extreme physical responses, it might be a sign that the stress is triggering a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So those who don't know about that language, fight, flight, freeze. So people know about those mostly, but fawn is anyone to kind of describe compliance or doing what the abuser is telling as a response because of that fear. So you can look that up if you want to learn more about that. And you'll see on the screen that both discipline and abuse have goals, right? But the goal of discipline is to be connected, guide that person in the right direction, but still feel love, kindness, respect, and safety, which is typically not present if it is harm and abuse. Okay. So next, people often ask about culture. So what is the role of culture? What if, I'm being told or I know that, this particular behavior that's viewed by maybe CPS or others isn't really abuse. They don't perceive it as abuse, or that they believe it to be ingrained in the culture. So sometimes students ask us about culture and how sometimes their family might say the way that they're behaving is how everyone else behaves in their culture. And while there's many ways of parenting around the world, that doesn't mean that anything goes, right? So as long as it's cultural, anything goes. Cultures are not homogenous. They're not all the same. The person who's defining culture might be benefiting from that definition and from the behavior. Sometimes people who abuse children blame their behavior on a cultural background as a way of justifying the abuse. So that's one thing to learn more about. Not the expert on that particular subject, but I wanted to note that as well. Okay. So lastly, about questions to consider, right? So maybe at this point you're like, okay, I understand that there's various different forms. There's financial, there's digital, there's sexual, there's reproductive, there's mental, verbal, all of these. Understand that. Got it. Understand that there's some warning signs. So what do I do if I suspect that someone that I'm helping or serving is experiencing family violence? How do I ask them? What are potential screening questions? So that's what this slide is for, to provide you some language, some examples. Again, you can either take a picture of this, but you'll also get it in your email, so don't worry, they're not going to go away. But some of these, and you'll notice in these questions, a lot of them aren't explicitly asking, hey, Susie, are you experiencing family violence? A lot of people don't know what that is, or even if they are, they don't identify with that term. So it's important that you ask more about, these questions like, do you feel unsafe in your home? Or do you feel like you're always walking on eggshells? Sometimes different metaphors work for some children. Do you feel like a parent or someone in the home is always mad at you and that you can't do anything right? That can be an indicator of emotional and mental or maybe even verbal abuse. Do you feel like a family member's love is conditional depending on the day or how you behave? That can be, again, getting into that component of the difference between discipline and abuse. Maybe feeling alone and isolated, that no one would understand their situation. A big one is, are you scared to disagree with a family member and fear that they would hurt you for doing so? Or being yelled at, insulted, called names, manipulated, threatened by a family member on a regular basis. So these are all questions. And I'll put a link for more age-specific questions that you can use to explore, but this is just a jumping off point to know more about screening and understanding someone's experience just a little bit more. So I do have, this is the second to last poll, so if you're kind of getting tired of voting, you're almost done. But I want to know if you all could see yourself asking some of these questions to someone that you're concerned about. And if you put no, I would like to invite you to maybe add a question that you would feel comfortable asking to someone that you're concerned about. Because this is not an exhaustive list. There's a lot of different ways to approach this and learn more. So we have about 30 more seconds to post your vote. I'm gonna grab some water. Okay, so it seems like the majority of us are saying yes. Some of us, one or two saying no and maybe, which is totally fine. Okay, I'm gonna share this. Does anyone, if anyone wants to add in the chat any questions that maybe it's your go-to question. Okay, if not, it's okay. Okay. So, all right, moving on to the next slide. If you do use that questionnaire, different questions from that, to find, and maybe you find out that they answer yes, that person that you're helping is experiencing family violence. Now at this point, it would be important to understand how they might be impacted. So in regard to sibling abuse, we'll return back to that from the beginning. Both perpetrators and victims of sibling abuse are at risk for poor outcomes. So those are all kind of listed on the screen there. So things like distress, low self-esteem, developmental delays, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, which we're having a webinar at the very end of the month about that, substance use disorders, eating disorders, and suicidality. Sometimes those things can even continue on into adulthood, right? So these symptoms typically can be as severe as those experienced by victims of peer bullying, is what a study found. So males involved in sibling violence tend to show more aggression and delinquency, while females experience more difficulties with psychological adjustment. So sibling violence is also a predictor for college dating violence as well. So there's a lot of continuing kind of across the lifespan of violence and setting the precedence for that and the norm for that at a young age. So many of these different impacts continue to follow the victim into adulthood, and with others that they form a relationship with or when they start their own families. And then now a little note about parental abuse. So aside from the immediate physical injuries that children can experience through maltreatment, a child's reactions to abuse or neglect can have lifelong and even intergenerational impacts. So childhood maltreatment can be linked to later physical, psychological, and behavioral consequences, as well as costs to society as a whole. These consequences can be independent of each other, but they may also be interrelated. So for an example, abuse or neglect may stunt physical development of the child's brain and lead to psychological problems such as low self-esteem, which could later snowball into high-risk behaviors such as substance abuse. The outcomes for each child may vary widely and are affected by a combination of factors, including the child's age, developmental status, when the maltreatment occurred, so the type, frequency, duration, and severity of the maltreatment, and the relationship between the child and the perpetrator. So lastly, children who experience maltreatment often are affected by other adverse experiences like parental substance abuse, domestic violence, poverty, which can make it difficult to separate the unique effects of that specific maltreatment. But that's just a little glimpse into those specific for parents and siblings. And I saw there was another hand raised. If you could type in the chat, let me know. If you want to be unmuted, send me a direct message and I can try to unmute you. It could also be a mistake. I know sometimes people say they do that on accident. Okay. So here's some more. I'm not going to read these all out to you, but there's 5 different categories for the lasting impacts of family violence. So unfortunately, I can't speak today, I'm so sorry. Experiencing violence when someone is younger can also have a way of impacting them as they grow older, right? So some people are physically impacted by family violence during the violence or even after it stops. So things like migraine, headaches, stomach or digestion problems, The psychological impacts might include, feeling an extreme amount of worry, the anxiety, depression. They might have extreme sadness over extended periods of time, flashbacks, ideas of suicide, being on high alert. So there's a lot of different components and impacts of that as well. One last one that I'll mention is economic impact. So if someone experiences financial abuse, they may struggle with the debt that they didn't cause themselves. So we've even had, people who have stayed with us at Women's Advocates, when they were children, they had different bills and different credit cards or other things kind of put in their name before they were either 18 or without their knowledge or their consent. So they might be struggling with that debt or trying to pay it off for many, many years later. And there is legal support for that too, so I wanted to name that. They might have trouble finding or keeping a job, or they might have healthcare costs if they were hospitalized or received medical treatment for any physical injuries. So all of this can sound kind of devastating, but we do want to emphasize that help is available if someone that you know or yourself has experienced family violence. You're by no means doomed, but it's important to know more about those impacts. So we're going to talk a little bit in not the next slide, but the following one about kind of recovery, healing, different things in that process. Okay. So if you attended the mental health webinar last month in May for National Mental Health Awareness Month, our mental health therapist, Saran, and I hosted 2 webinars with the same content about the impact of domestic violence on mental health. And we talked about these 2 cycles. So if you've already seen this is a repeat from that, but it is a really good reminder and I think is helpful for understanding what that incremental impact is. So to have a deeper understanding of how someone can be impacted by family violence, it can be useful to look at these 2 cycles side by side. So there are debates about how helpful this model can be, because one misconception that people commonly hold who haven't experienced family violence is that it's an isolated event. But we know that it's not a one-time isolated event. It's a pattern of behavior that an abuser causes and a victim lives within. So the cycle can be helpful in affirming that not every waking second is horrific and bad. There are good moments as seen during the honeymoon phase where maybe apologies and promises of change are made and hope is instilled. Maybe there's calm where everything is seemingly okay, where survivors might say, this person is the perfect parent, sibling, family member, whenever they're not enraged. But as you think about the cycle, what people might see or know about on the outside, it's important to know that cycle on the left, that it triggers that cycle that survivors experience, which can be understood as the cycle of anxiety. So while all this is going on, the survivor is learning this pattern. These conditions are really stressful and harmful for children and people in general to live and grow in. The tension can cause anxiety. The abuse can cause the survivor to seek refuge when the abuser goes to work or when the survivor goes to school. Maybe they use drugs or alcohol or cause trouble at school or enroll in every school activity to escape the anxiety and pain. And during the honeymoon phase, there might be a short-term relief from that anxiety where hope might be building. But the brain, after it's triggered that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, it can remember that pattern, and that anxiety never fully goes away. And then the cycle repeats itself again and again. So think about the lasting impacts that these 2 cycles, living in this seemingly never-ending cycle of chaos and distress, how can that impact someone? So I'd like you to think a little bit more about how in this process, what is the survivor learning? And I'm going to launch the very last poll about how knowing these cycles is relevant for you and your work. So how can knowing these cycles better help you support the people that you work with? Again, if I didn't write something that you resonate with, you can add it in the chat and I'll read it aloud for everyone. So I'll give you about 30 more seconds to kind of submit. And again, you can click multiple responses to vote for how understanding these cycles is helpful. The second webinar for this week is actually on breaking the cycle. So if you want to learn more about the cycles, about prevention work, how to get involved in prevention work, we'll have a specific webinar dedicated to that on Wednesday. And then Monday, we'll have one on engaging youth in particular. So if you're interested in any of those things, there'll be an opportunity for sure to learn more about how to break the cycle. But this is just a little preview of that. So I'll give you 5 more seconds. So it looks like a lot of people are saying that knowing these cycles can better understand the fluctuations of their experiences and emotions and responses. So I think that's really important because even when we did the child webinar, we were talking about how children perceive abuse. Sometimes it can be, they automatically, they think everyone's safe, everything's fine if a parent experiencing harm is no longer crying. Or there's just a lot of different ways. So those different periods that we just talked about can last for any amount of time, and that they don't have to exist in that exact order, but it's just to talk about there is a pattern, but there's also a level of unpredictability because you never know when it'll switch. People are also saying that knowing these 2 cycles can help better support a survivor's mental health, identify the pattern of abusive behavior. You could use these as tools as you're working with someone who's experiencing violence to say, do you resonate with this cycle, or what does this cycle look like for you in your life? Because it might be different. It can also help you look for opportunities, right, to be able to break the cycle, and say, during this time, what's going on in your brain? What's going on? What are other sources for support to connect with the community or other things like that? And then lastly, people did also select that it would generally inform them so they don't judge the unpredictability of it. So Marcy said, young adults on parents abuse topic. Lots of guilt with one of my clients, emotional, financial intimidation, coercive behavior, verbal. They said that they normally don't see that too much. Yeah, I've actually had a couple of presentations where someone has brought that up and said that, they're not a child as in that they're under 18. They're over 18, but they are, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, is that the young adult is causing harm to the parent. So that is absolutely something that does happen too. I can try to send you more resources specifically on that. I see that you're saying you've supported her for 6 months now, so I'm going to type a note to send out a specific email about that. Thank you for bringing that up. I know that's another one that a lot of people don't think about of, parents want to help their children, they want to support them, and if they're causing them harm, that can be really difficult too. So thank you for sharing that. I'll send out a resource. Okay, so this is what people said. That was the very last poll. We're almost to the end here. We'll definitely have ample time for questions. We might get done early, it looks like, so that's a little update. So a little more about recovery, okay? So on a positive note, many people do, quote unquote, recover or heal, find ways of progressively healing from family violence, and go on to have their own healthy, happy families. So studies have found that there's different components. These different components on the screen can be protective and help people who have experienced family violence. So some of these include having a sense of purpose, feeling in control of their own life, being able to manage their emotions, having healthy communication and relationship skills. So all of those things really talk about empowerment, and a lot of those things are also taken away from someone when they do experience violence, specifically family violence, right? So all of those things can be learned on their own, or with others, or with the help of a professional. So we also know that breaking isolation and making sure that people have a strong social network and community is really, really important and essential. And being surrounded by people who do love them unconditionally, care about them, support them, and promote their safety and wellness. So if you have any other thoughts about kind of the healing process or anything with that, feel free to type it in the chat. Okay. So a little more specifically on how you can support someone who is experiencing family violence. I know a lot of us are domestic violence advocates. So some of this might not be new to you, but for those of you who aren't, these are some more broad ways that you can help someone. So again, that number one way to support someone who's experiencing family violence is to listen and validate them. So believing what someone is going through is very meaningful because that person may have been told that no one would ever believe them. If you look at the top of the screen, there's some suggestions for how to specifically validate someone's experience. Truly listen to them, let them talk, let them express their emotions, let them cry, explain, or do whatever they need to do, whatever they need to share to feel comfortable, whatever they feel comfortable sharing, right? The second thing is offering support. So that might look different depending on your connection to them, what your role in the community is. So asking them what you can do to best support them is really helpful. So trying to make sure your advocacy is victim survivor centered and led. Maybe ask if they want you to check in on them every week, or ask the best way of how to do that. Remember, again, operate from the belief that they are the experts of their own experience and that you are there to collaborate with them, not necessarily dictate them and tell them exactly what they need to do. The third thing is provide resources. So we're going to have a ton of different resources, lots of things in this PowerPoint, and then also in the next few slides that I'll show you, and explain that these exist for them to provide options, right? So when you show these different resources to people or mention them, make sure that they know that they're just choices and that there are different options that are available for them to use. Okay. Next, if they don't make a phone call right away or try to act on it right away, respect their choices and let them go on their own timeline when they feel ready and able. So forcing them to do something immediately is not always helpful. But you can help them safety plan. So you can ask them if they think it would be helpful and useful for you to show them maybe an interactive guide. There's one on loveisrespect.org. I'll make sure to link that on the screen. Or walk them through the suggestions that I'm going to show in the next slide. Lastly, you can connect them with other people beside yourself who might help them. So that could be a teacher, a counselor, coach, classmate, friend, coworker, other people in their community, just to make sure they know that they are cared for and that they're not alone. Okay. So this is a specific resource about creating a self-care plan. So the next one talks more specifically about safety planning, but I think sometimes what gets missed with safety planning is exactly this, like having a plan to try to, not that, okay, sorry. One thing with safety planning is that it's, again, the person who is accountable for the abuse is the person causing it. It's not that, oh, you didn't safety plan well enough and that's why you're experiencing abuse. No. Safety planning a lot of times focuses on that immediate reaction to a very either lethal or life-threatening event, right? So say that person needs to get out of the house right away. They talk about, what do you need to carry in your emergency bag? Make sure you have your documents, make sure you have your medicine, make sure you have your keys and you have extra money and all these things, which is great. I'm not trying to discount that, but I think sometimes what's missing is, you know, aside from that, what can you do to help yourself in all these different categories, right? So how can you help your mind, you know, school, or you can replace that with work. So this is specifically for youth or children in creating safe and a self-care plan, but you can replace these categories for what's important to that adult as well if they're experiencing family violence. And then we have a lot of different self-care tips. If you want to download the PDF, we have the link on the screen as well. But I think that this self-care plan is really, really helpful to think of, you know, promoting those protective factors or promoting the things that help increase wellness, even if they can't control what the abuser is doing. Okay, let me know if there's any questions about that. We'll move on to the safety planning. So again, if you are a DV advocate, I'm sure you know a lot about safety planning. If you aren't, you can refer someone to a domestic violence advocate to get support in creating a safety plan. Um, so on the right, there's a bunch of links that are more specific. So we have one for children, we have one for teens, for college, for adults, more about tech safety, more about safety planning for survivors with disabilities. There's a lot of different resources out there. So I wanted to make sure you had access to those. I'll show you one example. So this is an example of just a one pager. So this specific one does focus more on those immediate responses in the case of an emergency. So it talks about a safe bag, it talks about safety tips. There's important numbers on here with different hotlines. Again, promoting that social support, we have an option for them to add, the name and the phone number. It might be really helpful to write down the phone number in case, digital violence is a part of the situation and the abuser takes the phone away and they don't know any numbers. It can be helpful to have this sheet, and a lot of people will print this sheet out and write it out and either give the sheet to a trusted person that they can access in the event of an emergency or an event where they feel like they need additional support. And then we have a section about, safe places to go to. So these are just prompts to think more about that. And then we do have more specific ones for particular ages. So this one is for kids. So you can see it's very colorful. It talks about warning signs. It talks about hand safety planning. So again, looking at the hands, where are 5 people that you can go to so they don't immediately feel alone? So there's a lot of different resources for kids there too. We have one specifically for teens also. So this was created by Love is Respect. So again, very similarly, there's stuff about emotional safety, knowing different resources in the community. Sometimes people don't feel the need to know those resources until they need it. So it's important to know about that. So you can definitely explore all those different resources. I wanted to make sure you know about those options. And then this is more about safety tips and planning. So we have some examples of everyday safety tips. So it can consider, where is someone's safe place? Where can they go when they feel unsafe? There's suggestions about practicing self-care and little ways to remind someone of things that might make them feel good or feel happy. We know that people who feel more sense of purpose might, be more inclined to seek help and eventually break out of that cycle of violence. So these are just some things to be aware of. More about resources. So these are a lot that we recommend for people experiencing family violence. There's a lot about youth resources. These are specific to Minnesota outside of Love is Respect. Love is Respect is accessible to anyone, of course. And then this is a screen capture of our safety resource hub. So I'll make sure you have a link to that. It's going to be on this next page too. So if you go to the hub, you'll see these different resources. So you'll see a trifold that's specific to youth, which is this first one. The one in the middle is more about adults, other specific resources. And then we have, it's over 100 pages now where you can search for specific things. So this link at the very top here is where you can access those safety resources. So I'll show you what that looks like really quickly. So we have a lot of different resources here. So you can click on a trifold, right, and download it, print it, send it to someone, whatever you think is helpful. This is the Google Drive. It constantly gets updated. If there's any resources that are missing, you're able to suggest and add new things. So there's different categories, so you can click on specific things. If you're interested in mental health services, you could click on mental health, click on that link, and it'll directly take you to that section of the document. It's quite large, so it takes a moment to load, but these are different resources for that. And then lastly, this is about our live chat feature. So we just launched that. If you have any questions or if you're a DV advocate yourself, you want some support, or if you're a healthcare provider or whatever your community role is, if you just have a question, you don't have to disclose who that person is or who you're helping or anything of that nature. You can say, hey, there's a situation, what would you recommend that I do? You can go to our website. There's a button at the top that says live chat now. You also might see a chat pop up. And you can talk directly or chat directly with someone anonymously about the situation that you're concerned about or about the person that you're concerned about. So please let people know about our live chat. Utilize it yourself. You can use it today and ask a specific question and we'll get back to you. So I wanted to mention that. This again, comprehensive links and resources for you to all explore. So please check that out. But that's all that I have. So we have a lot of time for a Q&A if you have any specific questions. So again, when you sign out of the webinar, you'll be directed to a post-webinar survey. So please let us know your thoughts, your feedback. This is our first time that we're doing a webinar series. Marcy, would you like to be unmuted? I see your hand is raised, or do you want to type in the chat? I'll try to find you. Oh, okay, I think the hand, sure, yes, okay, let me find you. All right, you are allowed to talk, so you can unmute yourself. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I had to apparently do my Alt-A to unmute myself. So. Okay. Well, hi, Brenisen, and everybody else. Not that they can say hi back to me. I just realized that. This was very, very informative. Thank you. So yeah, my biggest question would be the young adult on parent abuse topic. I've been trying to support my client off and on sporadically when she's in touch with me since December. And it's the young man, her oldest son is about 21 or 22. And I just wanted your input on that. I've given her but it was helpful when you just said a few minutes ago, in their own time frame, in their own, but it's very difficult for me as a mom myself because I have a 19-year-old son. So, basically taking some of that on and very, worrying about them and their family dynamics. I take it on, I take it home, and working from home since March, and then I get, and she's got health issues and she has a husband and I think they've got a younger son who's like 14 or so. And now it sounds like I'm worried that it's escalating because she texted me and said that he's, the 22-year-old son she's got dynamics where he's seeming to become aggressive and, that kind of worrisome behavior. And she even, back, I think it was in just February, she gave him a timeline and said, you need to move out by February. It was February 1st. And when she gave him that letter, he laughed at her in the parent's face, and so I've given her all of your, your information to reach out and get support, all this stuff, but, she has not, as far as I know. And so it's helpful when you said in their own time frame. So, but I'm not a social worker. I'm a case management assistant / they changed my title back in November to department navigator. So, your hands are tied. You can only do so much. But now I'm kind of contemplating my biggest thing when she texted me the other day saying, he's seeming to get, in a nutshell, I'm worried he's becoming more volatile. So I'm kind of, do I go and she didn't say he is, but I'm a little worried that, if he does become, then do I file if it becomes that on her behalf, can I just go I mean, she didn't say he's done anything to them. But I mean, if he's, there's that dynamic. It's not a child, but it's parents, but it's not, she didn't say he harmed us, but that's, that's the dynamic.
Yeah.
There are two parents, but there's a teenager in the home, but she didn't say he harmed the teenager. He's coercing her for money. He works. He won't move out. it's that dynamic.
Hmm.
So that,
Yeah.
lots of verbal abuse, financial abuse. He sits in her car. He won't get out of the car until, you know, she gives him money so she can go to work. Give me some of your money. That kind of, crazy stuff goes into their food, and guilts her until she says, yes, I'll buy your baby car
Right.
seat. Um, Guilts her, tells her she's evil if she won't give him money. All these kinds of, and then goes around slamming doors, and she won't give him a house key. Because she's afraid that he'll let people in the home, and you know, all kinds of other dynamics that are very basically, in a nutshell, emotional, verbally abusive,
Yeah.
coercive, and there are other things I'm not mentioning, but because I don't want to take too much of the time. But
Yeah. Well, I first want to say thank you for sharing that experience. It does sound very difficult to navigate, but it sounds like you're doing a lot of the right things, and we can definitely chat offline one-on-one if that would be helpful
yeah,
for you. But I will
yeah,
say just a couple of things. One thing is, again, you mentioned your role. So I think, again, we keep talking about what is our role in the community? What is the scope of our position? And I would absolutely
yeah.
recommend that you connect this individual with a DV advocate that can help, identify what is the goal, what is their specific plan, what do they want to
Yeah.
work towards, what is the timeline. And I'll
And
also
if they
send you some
won't,
resources too about avoiding burnout because doing this work can, like you said, you take it home with you. There's an emotional toll. There's certain things that are impacting you. So again, you can't pour from an empty cup. So making sure that
yeah.
you have the resources you need to
Well,
help.
and when they say, and when you told them multiple times and they won't, you know what I'm saying? I've given her your information, I've given her all
Mhm.
and the piece of it is the parental, child topic. And so if she had reached out to you, but I don't believe she has, she
Okay.
could have, you guys wouldn't have turned her away. She has not, as far as I know.
Okay.
And she also has, I've asked her the question because she's got a bit of an accent. She's from somewhere in Africa. She has not answered that question. I've met her uh, on 2, 3 occasions back before they made me start working from home back in March. And so on the phone, it might be a bit difficult for her um, to
Mhm.
have a conversation with people, slight accent.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I would
so I don't know
say.
if that's, go ahead.
Right. I would say the live chat might be a good option,
Yeah.
especially I know with COVID, a lot of people might
Mhm.
fear talking on the phone because they are,
Yeah.
isolated in a home with someone who's being abusive. So that might be
Right.
more accessible for her. So maybe sending the link to our website and saying, at your own time
Ah,
when you feel comfortable doing so,
great. Great idea.
maybe when that person is sleeping or they're out or they're doing something,
Yeah.
chat a little
Right.
bit and just get support and start to navigate, if they do think that the
Hmm.
situation is escalating, just her being aware that places like Women's Advocates is available.
Yeah.
Day one is a great hotline to learn more if
Yeah.
she does need emergency to get out of that home and even take, the non-violent teenager with her.
Right. Oh, that's great. Okay, that's a great idea. I could do a date. I could do the on her behalf. I could like do a speaker because I'm being mainly a bit concerned. Like if he stopped working because so much is shut down.
Yeah.
That's because he was working last I knew at a coffee shop.
Okay.
So for all I know, he's not working right now. And she hadn't said anything about that. So,
Right. Well,
uh,
I'll be sure to include resources in the email, and I'm more than happy to hop on a phone
thank
call with
you.
you or exchange emails
Perfect.
back and forth
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
to support you
Appreciate it.
more. Yeah. Okay. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Wesley. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Again, I'll send it in the chat right now. So what I'm sending is the link if you'd like a certificate of attendance for this webinar. You can fill that out. It takes just a couple seconds, and then you'll be directed to the survey, which if you'd like to fill that out now, you can do so. I'll send that link. If there's any other resources or support that people want, let me know, and I can send it in the email. This will be accessible By the end of the day, it just has a moment to upload onto YouTube. Yeah, reach out to Marcy if you've worked particularly with a case like hers. Definitely reach out. We're all a big community supporting one another. But I want to thank you all for spending your Monday morning learning more about family violence, engaging with me. I hope you all learned something new. Again, my email is on the screen, so feel free to send me any specific questions or concerns. I'm going to stop the recording